Chapter 11. Kind of an interesting chapter. We'll see. There we go. Personality. Personality refers to the long-standing traits, patterns, and that propel individuals to consistently think, feel, and behave in specific ways. That's why we have these masks over here. Our personality is what makes us unique individuals. Each person has an idiosyncratic pattern of enduring long-term characteristics and a manner in which he or she interacts with other individuals and the world around them. Our personalities are thought to be long-term, stable, and not easily changed. The word personality comes from the Latin word persona. In the ancient world, a persona was a mask worn by an actor, just like this. While we tend to think of a mask as being worn to conceal one's identity, the theatrical mask was originally used to either represent or project a specific personality trait of a character. The concept of personality has been studied for at least 2,000 years, beginning with Hippocrates in 370 BCE. Hippocrates theorized that personality traits and human behaviors are based on four separate temperaments associated with four fluids or humors of the body. The choleric temperament, the yellow bile from the liver; the melancholic temperament, the black bile from the kidneys; the sanguine temperament, the red blood from the heart; and the phlegmatic temperament, the white phlegm from the lungs. There you go. Phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, and blood. Centuries later, the influential Greek physician and philosopher Galen built on Hippocrates' theory, suggesting that both diseases and personality differences could be explained by imbalances in the humors that each person exhibits one of the four temperaments. The choleric person is passionate, ambitious, and bold. The melancholic person is reserved, anxious, and unhappy. The sanguine person is joyful, eager, and optimistic. The phlegmatic person is calm, reliable, and thoughtful. Galen's theory was prevalent for over 1,000 years and continued to be popular through the Middle Ages. In 1780, Franz Gall, a German physician, proposed that the distances between bumps on the skull reveal a person's personality traits, character, and mental abilities. According to Gall, measuring these distances revealed the sizes of the brain areas underneath, providing information that could be used to determine whether a person was friendly, prideful, murderous, kind, good with languages, and so on. Initially, phrenology was very popular. However, it was soon discredited for lack of empirical support and has long been relegated to the status of a pseudoscience. And that is a phrenologist map. I'm sorry, chart. Did I say map? Sigmund Freud's psychodynamic perspective of personality was the first comprehensive theory of personality, explaining a wide variety of both normal and abnormal behaviors. According to Freud, unconscious drives influenced by sex and aggression, along with childhood sexuality, are the forces that influence our personality. Freud attracted many followers who modified his ideas to create new theories about personality. These theorists, referred to as neo-Freudians, generally agreed with Freud that childhood experiences matter, but they reduced the emphasis on sex and focused more on the social environment than the effects of culture on personality. The perspective of personality proposed by Freud and his followers was the dominant theory of personality for the first half of the 20th century. Now, one of the things you have to remember about Freud, and if you want to argue with him, that's fine, but one of the things that you need to remember is that he was writing his theory in the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, when sexual repression was very common. It was common all over Europe. It was common in the United States, certainly. People tried to hide what they actually physically looked like with different types of clothing and whatnot. So Freud's theory had to do with mostly with sexual repression, because that was the common theme all over the world, not just in the United States and Europe, but also in Asia and Africa as well. Very uh, repressed sexually, very conservative mindset. Remember, this is during the Victorian era. Freud was the first to systematically study and theorize the workings of the unconscious mind in the manner that we associate with modern psychology. Freud observed individuals, most often women, who reported psychosomatic problems that had no physical basis. These problems were termed hysteria. Freud concluded that hysteria was a result of sexual abuse in childhood and that these traumatic experiences had been hidden from consciousness. It wasn't just sexual abuse that he was referring to, he was also referring to sexual repression, which you could say would be a form of sexual abuse. To explain the concept of conscious versus unconscious experience, Freud compared the mind to an iceberg. He said that only about 1/10 of the mind is conscious and the rest of the mind is unconscious. Our unconscious refers to the mental activity of which we are unaware and are unable to access. According to Freud, unacceptable urges and desires are kept in our unconscious through a process called repression. And that's what I was just talking about, repressed sexuality. We sometimes say that things that we don't intend to say by unintentionally substituting another word for the one that we meant. This is a Freudian slip. Freud suggested that slips of the tongue are actually sexual or aggressive urges accidentally slipping out of our unconscious. Speech errors such as this are quite common. Seeing them as a reflection of unconscious desires, linguists today have found that slips of the tongue tend to occur when we are tired, nervous, or not at all optimal level of cognitive functioning. I'm sorry, Mr. President, I meant bird flu strategy, not bird brain strategy. And this is George W. Bush. According to Freud, our personality develops from a conflict between two forces, our biological aggressive and pleasure-seeking drives versus our internal socialized control over these drives. Our personality is a result of our efforts to balance these two competing forces. Freud suggested that we can understand this by imagining three interacting systems within our minds. He called them the id, the ego, and the superego. And of course, the id is our instincts, the superego is our sense of morality, and ego is our reality. So the superego is always going after the id is always trying to break through the morality and the reality. The unconscious id contains our most primitive drives or urges and is present from birth. It directs impulses for hunger, thirst, and sex. Freud believed that the id operates on what he called the pleasure principle, in which the id seeks immediate gratification. Through social interactions with parents and others in a child's environment, the ego and the superego develop to help control the id. The superego develops as a child interacts with others, learning the social rules for right and wrong. The superego acts as our conscience. It is our moral compass that tells us how we should behave. It strives for perfection and judges our behavior, leading to feelings of pride, or, when we fall short of the ideal, feelings of guilt. So, as Freud stated, the superego acts as our conscience, punishing us when we break the rules. Dude, this is crazy. The textbook says, bro, shh. And there's the superego right there. Superego. The super I. Ego means I in Latin. In contrast to the instinctual id and the rule-based superego, the ego is the rational part of our personality. That's what Freud considered to be the self, and it is the part of our personality that is seen by others. Its job is to balance the demands of the id and the superego in the context of reality. Thus, it operates on what Freud called the reality principle. The ego helps the id satisfy its desires in a realistic way. The id wants you to go at 95 miles per hour. The superego wants you to go at 50 miles per hour, but the ego, reality, 55 miles per hour. The id and the superego are in constant conflict because the id wants instant gratification regardless of the consequences, but the superego tells us that we must behave in socially acceptable ways. Thus, the ego's job is to find the middle ground. It helps satisfy the id's desires in a rational way that will not lead us to feelings of guilt. According to Freud, a person who has a strong ego which can balance the demands of the id and the superego has a healthy personality. 50 laps, no excuses. This thing doesn't cover my fat rolls. Watch out, boys, here comes the hotness. Oh, I'm not exactly sure. That's 3 different people. Freud maintained that imbalances in the system can lead to neuroses, a tendency to experience negative emotions, anxiety disorders, or unhealthy behaviors. A person who is dominated by their id might be narcissistic and impulsive. A person with a dominant superego might be controlled by feelings of guilt and deny themselves even socially acceptable pleasures. Conversely, if the superego is weak or absent, a person might become a psychopath. An overly dominant superego might be seen in an over-controlled individual whose rational grasp on reality is so strong that they are unaware of their emotional needs, or in a neurotic way is overly defensive, overusing ego defense mechanisms. Freud believed that feelings of anxiety result from the ego's inability to mediate the conflict between the id and the superego. When this happens, Freud believed that the ego seeks to restore balance through various protective measures known as defense mechanisms. When certain events, feelings, or yearnings cause an individual anxiety, the individual wishes to reduce that anxiety. To do that, the individual's unconscious mind uses ego defense mechanisms, unconscious protective behaviors that aim to reduce anxiety. The ego, usually conscious, resorts to unconscious strivings to protect the ego from being overwhelmed by anxiety. When we use defense mechanisms, we are unaware that we are using them. Further, they operate on various ways that distort reality. According to Freud, we all use ego defense mechanisms. While everyone uses defense mechanisms, Freud believed that overuse of them may be problematic. Let's say Joe is a high school football player. Deep down, Joe feels sexually attracted to males. His conscious belief is that being gay is immoral, and that if he were gay, his family would disown him and he would be ostracized by his peers. Therefore, there is a conflict between his conscious beliefs, being gay is wrong and will result in being ostracized, and his unconscious urges, attraction to males. The idea that he might be gay causes Joe to have feelings of anxiety. How can he decrease his anxiety? Joe may find himself acting very macho, making gay jokes and picking on a school peer who is gay. This way, Joe's unconscious impulses are further submerged. There are several different types of defense mechanisms. In repression, anxiety-causing memories from consciousness are blocked. As an analogy, let's say your car is making a strange noise, but because you do not have the money to get it fixed, you just turn up the radio so that you no longer hear the strange sounds. Eventually, you forget about it. Similarly, in the human psyche, if a memory is too overwhelming to deal with, it might be repressed and thus removed from conscious awareness. This repressed memory might cause symptoms in other areas. Denial is where the individual refuses to accept real events because they are too unpleasant to acknowledge. Paul refuses to acknowledge that he has an alcohol problem despite the fact that he gets drunk every single day. Displacement is where an individual transfers inappropriate urges or behavior onto a more acceptable or less threatening target. Susan is mad at her husband, but instead of yelling at him at the restaurant, she verbally abuses the server instead. Projection is when an individual attributes unacceptable desires in them to others. When my first wife started having an affair, she also started accusing me of having an affair. It was very confusing. Rationalization is when an individual justifies behaviors by substituting acceptable reasons for less acceptable real reasons. Carla didn't pass her class because she kept skipping and missed taking all her tests, but she told all of her friends that she didn't pass because the professor didn't like her. Like professors like anybody, okay? Reaction formation is when an individual adopts beliefs contrary to their own beliefs in order to reduce anxiety. My mother-in-law told my wife after she met me that I was a gold digger and would leave her at the drop of a hat, but to my face she was as sweet as sugar. Regression is when an individual uses a coping strategy from a less mature stage of development to cope with a stressor. When Sylvie was attracted to the men in the bar when her husband was deployed, she began acting and talking like she did when she was a junior high cheerleader before she became sexually active. Sublimation is when an individual redirects their unacceptable desires through socially acceptable channels. Middle-aged Merle finds the teenage girls in his neighborhood attractive, but instead of flirting with them, he has become more religious and only preaches at them when he is around them. Freud believed that personality develops during early childhood. Childhood experiences shape our personalities as well as our behavior as adults. He asserted that we develop via a series of stages during childhood. Each of us must pass through these childhood stages, and if we do not have the proper nurturing and parenting during a stage, we will be stuck or fixated in that stage, even as adults. In each psychosexual stage of development, the child's pleasure-seeking urges coming from the id are focused on a different area of the body called an erogenous zone. The stages are oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital. During the time when Freud was developing his theories, a climate of sexual repression combined with limited understanding and education surrounding human sexuality heavily influenced Freud's perspective. Given that sex was a taboo topic, Freud assumed that negative emotional states, neuroses, stemmed from suppression of unconscious sexual and aggressive urges. For Freud, his own recollections and interpretations of patients' experiences and dreams were sufficient proof that psychosexual stages were universal events in early childhood. This is the way they dressed back in Freud's time. And as you can see, everything is covered. You can't see their feet. You can't see their ankles. You can't see their wrists. They've got everything on but a veil. They don't cover their faces. And you can't tell what their shape is. Look how big this dress is. That's not going to tell you what this lady's butt looks like. On the cover of Time magazine this week is one of the Kardashians, and she's got the biggest derriere that you ever saw. It's really kind of odd, and of course you couldn't tell that if she were dressed up like this, you couldn't tell how big her fanny was. In the oral stage, birth to 1 year, pleasure is focused on the mouth. Eating and pleasure derived from sucking, nipples, pacifiers, and thumbs play a large part in the baby's first year of life. At around 1 year of age, babies are weaned from the bottle or breast, and this process can create conflict if not handled properly by caregivers. According to Freud, an adult who smokes, drinks, overeats, or bites her nails is fixated in the oral stage of her psychosexual development. She may have been weaned too early or too late, resulting in these fixation tendencies, all of which seek to ease anxiety. I just realized that I may have said something inappropriate. Let me show you what I was talking about so that you can see what I was talking about. Time magazine. There we go. Okay. Come on. Come on. Time magazine. There we go. Yeah, you can see how extreme this is. And I have no idea why they dressed her this way, but you can see how extreme her figure is. That's what I was actually talking about. I wasn't commenting on anything other than the fact. It's one of the Kardashians. Kim, that's Kim Kardashian. Yeah. Anyway, yeah, that's what I was talking about. I didn't mean to be inappropriate. Okay. After passing through the oral stage, children enter what Freud termed the anal stage, the 1 to 3 year, between 1 to 3 years. In this stage, children experience pleasure in their bowel and bladder movements so that it makes sense that the conflict in this stage is over toilet training. During this stage of development, children work to master control of themselves. Freud suggested that success at the anal stage depending on how parents handle toilet training. Parents who offer praise and rewards encourage positive results and can help children feel competent. Parents who are harsh in toilet training can cause a child to become so fearful of soiling that they over-control and become fixated at the anal stage, leading to the development of anal retentive personality. The anal retentive personality is stingy and stubborn, has a compulsive need for order and neatness, and might be considered a perfectionist. If parents are too lenient in toilet training, the child may fail to develop sufficient self-control, become fixated at this stage, and develop an anal expulsive personality. The anal expulsive personality is messy, careless, disorganized, and prone to emotional outbursts. Freud's third stage of psychosexual development is the phallic stage, between ages 3 and 6. Corresponding to the age when children become aware of their bodies and recognize the differences between boys and girls. The erogenous zone in this stage is the genitals. Conflict arises when the child feels a desire for the opposite sex parent and jealousy and hatred toward the same sex parent. For boys, this is called the Oedipus complex, involving a boy's desire for his mother and his urge to replace his father, who is seen as a rival for the mother's attention. At the same time, the boy is afraid his father will punish him for his feelings, so he experiences castration anxiety. The Oedipus complex is successfully resolved when the boy begins to identify with his father as an indirect way to have the mother. Failure to resolve the Oedipus complex may result in fixation and development of a personality that might be described as vain and overly ambitious. Girls experience a comparable conflict in the phallic stage, the Electra complex. The Electra complex, while often attributed to Freud, was actually proposed by Freud's protege, Carl Jung. A girl desires the attention of her father and wishes to take her mother's place. Jung also said that girls are angry with the mother for not providing them with a penis, hence the term penis envy. While Freud initially embraced the Electra complex as a parallel to the Oedipus complex, he later rejected it, yet it remains as a cornerstone of Freudian theory, thanks in part to academics in the field. Following the phallic stage of psychosexual development is a period known as the latency period, 6 years to puberty. This period is not considered a stage because sexual feelings are dormant as children focus on their other pursuits such as school, friendships, hobbies, and sports. Children generally engage in activities with peers of the same sex, which serves to consolidate a child's gender role identity. The final stage is the genital stage, from puberty on. In this stage, there is a sexual reawakening as the incestuous urges resurface. The young person redirects these urges to other more socially acceptable partners who often resemble the other sex parent. People in this stage have mature sexual interests, which for Freud meant a strong desire for the opposite sex. Individuals who successfully completed the previous stages, reaching the genital stage with no fixations, are said to be well-balanced, healthy adults. While most of Freud's ideas have not found support in modern research, we cannot discount the contributions that Freud has made to the field of psychology. It was Freud who pointed out that a large part of our mental life is influenced by experiences of early childhood and takes place outside our conscious awareness. His theories paved the way for others. while Freud's focus on biological drives led him to emphasize the impact of sociocultural factors on personality development. His followers quickly realized that biology alone could not account for the diversity they encountered as the practice of psychoanalysis spread during the time of the Nazi Holocaust. The anti-Semitism, which was prevalent during this period of time, may have led mainstream psychoanalysts to focus primarily on the universality of the psychological structures of the mind. Freud attracted many followers who had modified his ideas to create new theories about personality. These theorists, referred to as Neo-Freudians, generally agreed with Freud that childhood experiences matter, but de-emphasized sex, focusing more on the social environment and the effects of culture on personality. Four notable Neo-Freudians include Alfred Adler, and that's this guy, Erik Erikson, that's this guy, Carl Jung, that's that guy, and this, of course, is Karen Horney. Alfred Adler, a colleague of Freud's, was the first major theorist to break away from Freud. He subsequently founded a school of psychology called individual psychology, which focuses on our drive to compensate for feelings of inferiority. Adler proposed the concept of the inferiority complex. An inferiority complex refers to a person's feelings that they lack worth and don't measure up to the standards of others or of society. Adler's ideas about inferiority represent a major difference between his thinking and Freud's. Freud believed that we are motivated by sexual and aggressive urges, but Adler believed that feelings of inferiority in childhood are what drive people to attempt to gain superiority, and that this striving is the force behind all of our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. Adler believed in the importance of social connections, seeing childhood development emerging through social development rather than the sexual stages Freud outlined. Adler noted the interrelatedness of humanity and the need to work together for the betterment of all. He said the happiness of mankind lies in working together and living as if each individual had set himself in the task of contributing to the common welfare, with the main goal of psychology being to recognize the equal rights and equality of others. Rather than focus on sexual or aggressive motives for behavior, as Freud did, Adler focused on social motives. Adler identified three fundamental social tasks that all of us must experience: occupational tasks like careers, societal tasks such as friendships, and love tasks, finding an intimate partner for a long-term relationship. He also emphasized conscious rather than unconscious motivation, since he believed that the three fundamental social tasks are explicitly known and pursued. That is not to say that Adler did not also believe in unconscious processes. He did, but he felt that conscious processes were more important. One of Adler's major contributions to personality psychology was the idea that our birth order shapes our personality. He proposed that older siblings who start out as the focus of their parents' attention, but must share that attention once a new child joins the family, compensate by becoming overachievers. Sorry. The youngest children, according to Adler, may be spoiled, leaving the middle child with the opportunity to minimize the negative dynamics of the youngest and oldest children. Erik Erikson met Freud's daughter Anna Freud while he was tutoring in Vienna. It was Anna Freud who encouraged Erikson to study psychoanalysis. In 1933, as Nazism spread across Europe, Erikson fled the country and immigrated to the United States. Erikson later proposed a psychosocial theory of development, suggesting that an individual's personality develops throughout the lifespan, a departure from Freud's view that personality is fixed in early life. In his theory, Erikson emphasized the social relationships that are important at each stage of personality development, in contrast to Freud's emphasis on sex. Erikson identified 8 stages, each of which represents a conflict or developmental task. The development of a healthy personality and a sense of competence depends on the successful completion of each task. And these are the tasks. Erikson stages, what you're trying to develop is hope, will, purpose, competency, fidelity, love, care, and wisdom. And so hope is trust versus mistrust. Will is autonomy versus shame and doubt. Purpose is initiative versus guilt. Competency is industry versus inferiority. Fidelity is identity confusion. Love is intimacy versus isolation. Care is generativity versus stagnation. And wisdom is integrity versus despair. Carl Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist and protege of Freud, who later split off from him and developed his own theory, which he called analytical psychology. The focus of analytical psychology is on working to balance opposing forces of conscious and unconscious thought and experience within one's personality. According to Jung, this work is a continuous learning process, mainly occurring in the second half of life, of becoming aware of unconscious elements and integrating them into our consciousness. Jung's split from Freud was based on 2 major disagreements. First, Jung, like Adler and Erikson, did not accept that sexual drive was a primary motivator in a person's mental life. Second, although Jung agreed with Freud's concept of a personal unconscious, he thought it to be incomplete. In addition to the personal unconscious, Jung focused on the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious is a universal version of the personal unconscious, holding mental patterns or memory traces, which are common to all of us. These ancestral memories, which Jung called archetypes, are represented by universal themes in various cultures, as expressed through literature, art, and dreams. Jung said that these themes reflect common experiences of the people of the world over, such as facing death, becoming independent, and striving for mastery. Jung believed that through biology, each person is handed down the same themes and that the same types of symbols, such as the hero, the maiden, the sage, and the trickster, are present in the folklore and fairy tales of every culture. In Jung's view, the task of integrating these unconscious archetypal aspects of the self is part of the self-realization process in the second half of life. With this orientation toward self-realization, Jung parted ways with Freud's belief that personality is determined solely by past events and anticipated the humanistic movement with its emphasis on self-actualization and orientation toward the future. Jung also proposed 2 attitudes or approaches toward life, extroversion and introversion. These ideas are considered Jung's most important contributions to the field of personality psychology, as almost all models of personality now include these concepts. If you are an extrovert, then you are a person who is energized by being outgoing and socially oriented. You derive your energy from being around others. If you are an introvert, then you are a person who may be quiet and reserved, or you may be social, but your energy is derived from your inner psychic activity. Jung believed a balance between extroversion and introversion best served the goal of self-realization. Quarantine time. Okay, introvert, extrovert. Okay. So if you were, we were all quarantined, so if you handled it this way, you're an introvert. If you handled it this way, you're an extrovert. Another concept proposed by Jung was a persona, which he referred to as a mask that we adopt. According to Jung, we consciously create this persona. However, it is derived from both our conscious experiences and our collective unconscious. Jung believed that the persona is a compromise between who we really are, our true self, and what society expects us to be. We hide those parts of ourselves that are not aligned with society's expectations. Karen Horney was one of the first women trained as a Freudian psychoanalyst. During the Great Depression, Horney moved from Germany to the United States and subsequently moved away from Freud's teachings. Like Jung, Horney believed that each individual has the potential for self-realization and that the goal of psychoanalysis should be moving toward a healthy self rather than exploring early childhood patterns of dysfunction. Horney also disagreed with Freudian's idea that girls have a penis envy and are jealous of male biological features. According to Horney, any jealousy is most likely culturally based due to the greater privileges that males often have, meaning that the differences between men's and women's personalities are culturally based, not biologically based. She further suggested that men have womb envy because they cannot give birth. Horney's theories focused on the role of unconscious anxiety. She suggested that normal growth can be blocked by basic anxiety stemming from needs not being met, such as childhood experiences of loneliness and or isolation. Horney suggested three types of coping. The first coping style, moving toward people, relies on affiliation and dependence. These children become dependent on their parents and other caregivers in an effort to receive attention and affection, which provides relief from anxiety. When these children grow up, they tend to use the same coping strategies to deal with relationships, expressing an intense need for love and acceptance. The second coping style, moving against people, relies on aggression and assertiveness. Children with this coping style find that fighting is the best way to deal with an unhappy home situation, and they deal with their feelings of insecurity by bullying other children. As adults, people with this coping style tend to lash out with hurtful comments and exploit others. The third coping style, moving away from people, centers on detachment and isolation. These children handle their anxiety by withdrawing from the world. They need privacy and tend to be self-sufficient. When these children are adults, they continue to avoid such things as love and friendship, and they also tend to gravitate toward careers that require little interaction with others. Behaviorists do not believe in biological determinism. They do not see personality traits as inborn. Instead, they view personality as significantly shaped by the reinforcements and consequences of outside of the organism. In other words, people behave in a consistent manner based on prior learning. B.F. Skinner, a strict behaviorist, believed that environment was solely responsible for all behavior, including the enduring, consistent behavior patterns studied by personality theorists. Skinner proposed that we demonstrate consistent behavior patterns because we have developed certain response tendencies. We learn to behave in particular ways. We increase the behaviors that lead to positive consequences, and we decrease the behaviors that lead to negative consequences. Skinner disagreed with Freud's idea that personality is fixed in childhood. He argued that personality develops over our entire life, not only in the first few years. Bandura proposed the concept of reciprocal determinism, in which cognitive processes, behavior, and context all interact, each factor influencing and being influenced by others simultaneously. Cognitive processes refer to all characteristics previously learned, including beliefs, expectations, and personality characteristics. Behavior refers to anything that we do that may be rewarded or punished. Finally, the context in which the behavior occurs refers to the environment or situation, which includes rewarding and punishing stimuli. Bandura's key contribution to learning theory was the idea that much learning is vicarious. We learn by observing someone else's behavior and its consequences, which Bandura called observational learning. He felt that this type of learning also plays a part in the development of our personality. Just as we learn individual behaviors, we learn new behavior patterns when we see them performed by other people or models. Drawing on the behaviorist idea about reinforcement, Bandura suggested that whether we choose to imitate a model's behavior depends on whether we see the model reinforced or punished. Through observational learning, we come to learn what behaviors are acceptable and rewarded in our culture, and we also learn to inhibit deviant or socially unacceptable behaviors by seeing what behaviors are punished. Bandura has studied a number of cognitive and personal factors that affect learning and personality development, and most recently has focused on the concept of self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is our level of confidence in our own abilities, developed through our social experiences. Self-efficacy affects how we approach challenges and reach goals. In observational learning, self-efficacy is a cognitive factor that affects which behaviors we choose to imitate, as well as our success in performing those behaviors. Julian Rotter, in 1966, proposed the concept of locus of control, another cognitive factor that affects learning and personality development. Distinct from self-efficacy, which involves our belief in our own abilities, locus of control refers to our beliefs about the power we have over our lives. In Rotter's view, people possess either an internal or external locus of control. Those with an internal locus of control, internals, tend to believe that most of their outcomes are the direct result of their efforts. Those with an external locus of control, externals, tend to believe that their outcomes are outside of their control. Externals see their lives as being controlled by other people, luck, or chance. Walter Mischel worked with delayed gratification and personality. Mischel determined that when willingness to delay gratification becomes part of the individual's personality, the individual is able to become a more successful student, had higher SAT scores, had positive peer relationships, were less likely to have substance abuse issues. As adults, they also had more stable marriages. Later, researchers determined that delayed gratification was situational and not an absolute personality trait. As the third force in psychology, humanism is touted as a reaction both to the pessimistic determinism of psychoanalysis, with its emphasis on psychological disturbance, and to the behaviorist view of humans passively reacting to the environment, which has been criticized as making people out to be personalityless robots. It does not suggest that psychoanalytic behaviorists and other points of view are incorrect, but argues that these perspectives do not recognize the depth and the meaning of human experience, and fail to recognize the innate capacity for self-directed change and transforming personal experiences. The humanist perspective focuses on how healthy people develop. One pioneering humanist, Abraham Maslow, studied people who he considered to be healthy, creative, and productive, including Albert Einstein, Eleanor Roosevelt, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, and others. Maslow found that such people share similar characteristics such as being open, creative, loving, spontaneous, compassionate, concern for others, and accepting of themselves. Humanist Carl Rogers' main ideas about personality regarded self-concept, our thoughts and feelings about ourselves. Rogers further divided the self into two categories, the ideal self and the real self. The ideal self is a person that you would like to be. The real self is the person you actually are. Rogers focused on the idea that we need to achieve consistency between these two selves. We experience congruence when our thoughts about our real self and ideal self are very similar. In other words, when our self-concept is accurate. High congruence leads to a greater sense of self-worth and a healthy, productive life. Parents can help their children achieve this by giving them unconditional positive regard or unconditional love. According to Rogers, as persons are accepted and prized, they tend to develop a more caring attitude towards others. Caring attitude toward themselves. Conversely, when there is a great discrepancy between our ideal and actual selves, we experience a state Rogers called incongruence, which can lead to maladjustment. The Minnesota study of twins reared apart conducted research with twins from 1979 to 1999. In studying 300 pairs of twins, including pairs of identical and fraternal twins reared together and apart, researchers found that identical twins, whether raised together or apart, have very similar personalities. These findings suggest the heritability of some personality traits. Heritability refers to the proportion of difference between people that are attributed to genetics. Some of the traits that this study reported as having more than a 0.50 heritability ratio included leadership, obedience to authority, a sense of well-being, alienation, resistance to stress, and fearfulness. The implication is that some aspects of our personalities are largely controlled by genetics. However, it's important to point out that traits are not determined by a single gene, but by a combination of many genes, as well as by epigenetic factors that control whether the genes are expressed. Most contemporary psychologists believe that temperament has a biological basis due to its appearance very early in our lives, and this is according to Rothbard in 2011. Thomas and Chess in 1977 found that babies could be categorized into one of three temperaments: easy, difficult, or slow to warm. However, environmental factors, family interactions, for example, and maturation can affect the ways in which children's personalities are expressed. Research suggests that there are two dimensions of our temperament that are important parts of our adult personality: reactivity and self-regulation. Reactivity refers to how we respond to new or challenging environmental stimuli. Self-regulation refers to our ability to control that response. Trait theorists believe personality can be understood via the approach that all people have certain traits and characteristic ways of behaving. Trait theorist Gordon Allport found 4,500 words in English language that could describe people. He organized these personality traits into three categories: cardinal traits, central traits, and secondary traits. A cardinal trait is one that dominates your entire personality and hence your life. Cardinal traits are not very common. Few people have personalities dominated by a single trait. Instead, our personalities typically are composed of multiple traits. Central traits are those that make up our personalities, such as loyal, kind, agreeable, friendly, sneaky, wild, and grouchy. Secondary traits are those that are not quite as obvious or as consistent as central traits. They are present under specific circumstances and include preferences and attitudes. In an effort to make the list of traits more manageable, Raymond Cattell narrowed down this to 16 factors or dimensions of personality: warmth, reasoning, emotional stability, dominance, liveliness, rule consciousness, social boldness, sensitivity, vigilance, abstractedness, privateness, apprehension, openness to change, self-reliance, perfectionism, and tension. He developed a personality assessment based on these 16 factors called the 16 PF. PF standing for personality factors. Instead of a trait being present or absent, each dimension is scored over a continuum from high to low. And there are the 16 right there. Psychologists Hans and Sybil Eysenck were personality theorists who focused on temperament, the inborn genetically based personality. They believe personality is largely governed by biology. The Eysencks viewed people as having two specific personality dimensions: introversion versus extroversion, and neuroticism versus stability. That was really kind of an interesting picture because the two parents, rather than looking at the daughter, are looking at the cat. Well, one's holding the cat, the other is staring very fixedly on the cat. So how does this little girl think at that time? According to Eysenck's theory, people high on the trait of extroversion are sociable and outgoing and readily connect with others, whereas people high on the trait of introversion have a higher need to be alone, engage in solitary behaviors, and limit their interactions with others. In the neuroticism stability dimension, people high on neuroticism tend to be anxious, they tend to have an overactive sympathetic nervous system, and even with low stress, their bodies and emotional states tend to go into a fight or flight reaction. People high on stability tend to need more stimulation to activate their flight or fight reaction and are considered more emotionally stable. Later, the Eysencks added a third dimension: psychoticism versus superego control. In this dimension, people who are high on psychoticism tend to be independent thinkers, cold nonconformists, impulsive, antisocial, and hostile. Whereas people who are high on superego control tend to have high impulse control. They're altruistic, empathic, cooperation, and conventional. Another personality theory is the five-factor model, with the 5 factors referred to as the big five personality factors. It is the most popular theory in personality psychology today, and the most accurate approximation of the basic personality dimension. The 5 factors are openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. In the 5-factor model, each person has each factor, but they occur along a spectrum. Openness to experience is characterized by imagination, feelings, actions, and actions and ideas. People who score high on this factor tend to be curious and have a wide range of interests. Conscientiousness is characterized by competence, self-discipline, thoughtfulness, and achievement striving, goal-directed behavior. People who score high on this factor are hardworking and dependable. Numerous studies have found a positive correlation between conscientiousness and academic success. A friend of mine always keeps his nose to the grindstone, and that's what it would look like if you actually did keep your nose to the grindstone. Extroversion is characterized by sociability, assertiveness, excitement seeking, and emotional expression. People who score high on this factor are usually described as outgoing and warm. Not surprisingly, people who score high on both extroversion and openness are more likely to participate in adventure and risky sports due to their curious and excitement-seeking nature. The 4th factor is agreeableness, which is the tendency to be pleasant, cooperative, trustworthy, and good-natured. People who score low on agreeableness tend to be described as rude and uncooperative. Yet one recent study reported that men who scored low on this factor actually earned more money than men who were considered more agreeable. Neuroticism is the tendency to experience negative emotions. People high on neuroticism tend to experience emotional instability and are characterized as angry, impulsive, and hostile. Watson and Clark in 1984 found that people reporting high levels of neuroticism also tended to report feeling anxious and unhappy. People who score low on neuroticism tend to be calm and even-tempered. The big five personality factors each represent a range between two extremes. Most of us tend to lie somewhere midway along the continuum of each factor rather than at polar ends. It's important to note that the big five factors are relatively stable over our lifespan, with some tendency for the factors to increase or decrease slightly. Researchers have found that conscientiousness increases through young adulthood into middle age as we become better able to manage our personal relationships and careers. Agreeableness also increases with age, peaking between 50 and 70 years. Neuroticism and extroversion tend to decline slightly with age. The big five factors have been shown to exist across ethnicities, cultures, and ages, and may have substantial biological and genetic components. Personality is shaped by both genetic and environmental factors. The culture in which we live is one of the most important environmental factors that shapes our personality. The term culture refers to all of the beliefs, customs, arts, and traditions of a particular society. Culture is transmitted to people through language as well as through the modeling of culturally acceptable and non-acceptable behaviors that are either rewarded or punished. Personality psychologists have become interested in the role of culture in understanding personality. It appears that there are both universal and culture-specific aspects that account for variation in people's personalities. Western ideas about personality may not be applicable to other cultures. The strength of personality traits varies across cultures. Asian cultures are more collectivist, and people in these cultures tend to be less extroverted, skewing the big five. People in Central and South American cultures tend to score higher on the big five in openness to experience, whereas the Europeans score higher on neuroticism. There seems to be regional personality differences within the United States. Researchers analyzed responses from over 1.5 million individuals in the United States and found that there are three distinct regional personality clusters. Cluster 1 is the upper Midwest Deep South and is dominated by people who fall into the friendly and conventional personality. That's this section, this blue section on the paper. Cluster 2 includes the West and is dominated by people who are more relaxed, emotionally stable, calm, and creative, and that's where you guys are. Cluster 3 is the Northeast, has more people who are stressed, irritable, and depressed. And then people who live in clusters 2 and 3 are also generally more open. And that's according to Renfro et al. In 2013. One explanation for the regional differences is selective migration. Selective migration is the concept that people choose to move to places that are compatible with their personalities and needs. Renfro and colleagues in 2009 noted an overlap between geographical regions and personality characteristics that goes beyond the often used explanations of religion, racial diversity, and education. Their research suggests that the psychological profile of the region is closely related to that of its residents. They found that levels of openness and conscientiousness in a state may predict voting patterns, indicating that there are correlations between geographic regions and personality differences between liberals and conservatives relating to the political views, levels of economic vitality, and entrepreneurial rates. Individualist cultures and collectivist cultures place emphasis on different basic values. People who live in individualist cultures tend to believe that independence, competition, and personal achievement are important. Individuals in Western nations, such as the United States, England, and Australia, score high on individualism. People who live in collectivist cultures value social harmony, respectfulness, and group needs over individual needs. Individuals who live in countries in Asia, Africa, and South America score high on collectivism. Dana in 1986 suggested that personality assessment services for North Americans are often provided without a proper recognition of culture-specific responses and tribe-specific frame of reference. Assessors need to have more than a general knowledge of history, tribal differences, contemporary culture, or reservations, and levels of acculturation in order to interpret psychological test responses with a minimal bias. There are three approaches that can be used to study personality in a cultural context: the cultural comparative approach, the indigenous approach, and the combined approach, which incorporates elements of both views. Since ideas about personality have a Western basis, the cultural comparative approach seeks to test Western ideas about personality in other cultures to determine whether they can be generalized and if they have cultural validity. And this is according to Chung van der Viver and Leong in 2011. Researchers used the cultural comparative approach to test the universality of the five-factor model. They found applicability in numerous cultures around the world, with Big Five-factor being stable in many cultures. The indigenous approach came about in reaction to the dominance of Western approaches to the study of personality in non-Western settings. Because Western-based personality assessments cannot fully be captured the personality constructs of the cultures, the indigenous model has led to the development of personality assessment instruments that are based on constructs relevant to the culture being studied. And this is according to Chung et al. In 2011. The third approach to cross-cultural studies of personality is the combined approach, which serves as a bridge between Western and indigenous psychology as a way of understanding both universal and cultural variations in personality. Self-report inventories are a kind of projective test used to assess personality. They typically use multiple choice items or numbered scales, which represent a range from 1, strongly disagree, to 5, strongly agree. Self-report inventories are generally easy to administer and cost-effective. There is an increased likelihood of test takers being inclined to answer in ways that are intentionally or unintentionally more socially desirable, exaggerated, biased, or misleading. One of the most widely used personality inventories is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, or the MMPI. First published in 1943 with 504 true and false questions, and updated to the MMPI-2 in 1989 with 567 questions. The original MMPI was based on a small, limited sample composed mostly of Minnesota farmers and psychiatric patients. The revised inventory was based on a more representative national sample to allow for better standardization. The MMPI-2 takes 1 to 2 hours to complete. The responses are scored to produce a clinical profile composed of 10 scales: hypochondriasis, depression, hysteria, psychopathic deviance, social deviance, masculinity versus femininity, paranoia, psychoasthenia, obsessive compulsive qualities, schizophrenia, hypomania, and social introversion. There's also a scale to certain risk factors for alcohol abuse. In 2008, the test was again revised using more advanced methods to the MMPI-2RF. This version takes about 1/2 the time to complete and has only 338 questions. Despite the new tests advantage, the MMPI-2 is more established and is still more widely used. Typically, the tests are administered by computer. Although the MMPI was originally developed to assist the clinical diagnosis of psychological disorders, it is now also used for occupational screening, such as in law enforcement and in college, career, and marital counseling. In addition to clinical scales, the tests also have validity and reliability scales. One of the validity scales, the Lie scale or L scale, consists of 15 items and is used to ascertain whether the respondent is faking good underreporting psychological problems to appear healthier. The reliability scales test on an instrument's consistency over time, assuring that if you take the MMPI 2RF today, and then again 5 years later, your two scores will be similar. Butler and colleagues in 1988 gave the MMPI to newly recruited police officers and then to the same police officers 2 years later. After 2 years on the job, the police officers' responses indicated an increased vulnerability to alcoholism, somatic symptoms, vague, unexplained physical complaints, and anxiety. When the test was given to additional 2 years later, 4 years after starting on the job, the results suggested high risk for alcohol-related difficulties. Another method for assessment of personality is projective testing. This kind of test relies on one of the defense mechanisms proposed by Freud, projection, as a way to assess unconscious processes. During this type of testing, a series of ambiguous cards is shown to the person being tested, who then is encouraged to project his feelings, impulses, and the desires onto the cards by telling a story, interpreting an image, or completing a sentence. Many projective tests have undergone standardization procedures and can be used to assess whether someone has unusual thoughts or a high level of anxiety or is likely to become volatile. Some examples of projective tests are the Rorschach inkblot test, which is what we just saw, the thematic apperception test, the TAT, which is on the right, and the contemporizing themes concerning blacks test, the TEMIS, Tell Me a Story, and the Rotter Incomplete Semantic blank. Project. This is a picture from the TAT, and so is that one. Projective tests are less subject to intentional distortion. It is hard to fake good because it is not obvious what a good answer is. Projective tests are more time-consuming for the evaluator than self-report inventories. If an evaluator scores a Rorschach using the Exner scoring system, the test is considered a valid and reliable measure. However, the validity of the other projective tests is questionable, and the results are often not usable for court cases. The Rorschach inkblot test was developed in 1921 by a Swiss psychologist named Hermann Rorschach, and that's him right there. I think he looks like I'm sorry. You tell me who he looks like. It is a series of symmetrical inkblot cards that are presented to a client by a psychologist. Upon presentation of each card, the psychologist asks the client, "What might this be?" What the test taker sees reveals unconscious feelings and struggles. The Rorschach has been standardized using the Exner system and is effective in measuring depression, psychosis, and anxiety. I keep thinking Matt Damon, but that's not who I'm thinking. Come on. I'm about to fall asleep, so I said turkey earlier. That was because I was asleep. Why can't I think of who I think this looks like? The guy in Fury. Oh, there he is. Okay, yeah, whoever that guy is, that's who I think he looks like. All right. And maybe not. His mouth is the same. His eyes are the same. This guy's got a widow's peak. There we go. Anyway, I guess he doesn't. The thematic apperception test was created in the 1930s by Henry Murray and Christiana Morgan. A person taking the TAT is shown 8 to 12 ambiguous pictures and is asked to tell a story about each picture. Why can't I think of his name? The stories give insight into their social world, revealing hopes, fears, interests, and goals. The storytelling format helps to lower a person's resistance, divulging unconscious personal details. This is according to Kramer in 2004. The TAT has been used in clinical settings to evaluate psychological disorders. More recently, it has been used to counsel in counseling settings to help clients gain a better understanding of themselves and achieve personal growth. Standardization of test administration is virtually non-existent among clinicians, and the test tends to be modest to low on validity and reliability. This is a picture from the TAT. That's a picture from the TAT, and so is that. Oops, sorry. A third projective test is the Rotter Incomplete Sentence Blank, developed by Julian Rotter in 1950. There are 3 forms of this test for use with different age groups: the school form, the college form, and the adult form. The tests include 40 incomplete sentences that people are asked to complete as quickly as possible. The average time for completing the test is approximately 20 minutes, as responses are only 1 to 2 words in length. This test is similar to a word association test, and like other types of projective tests, it is presumed that responses will reveal desires, fears, and struggles. The IRSB is used in screening college students for adjustment problems and in career counseling. And there's your questions right there. Robert Williams developed the first culturally specific projective test designed to reflect the everyday life experiences of African Americans. The updated version of the instrument is the contemporized Themes Concerning Blacks test. The CTCB contains 20 color images that showed scenes of African American lifestyles. When the CTCB was compared with the TAT, for most African Americans, it was found that the use of the CTCB led to increased story length, higher degrees of positive feelings, and stronger identification with the CTCB. The TEMIS Multicultural Thematic Apperception Test is another tool designed to be culturally relevant to minority groups, especially Hispanic youths. The TEMIS, standing for Tell Me a Story, but also a play on the Spanish word temas, or themes, uses images and storytelling cues that relate to minority culture. And this is according to Constantino in 1982. And that is finally the end of the chapter, and I still can't think of what that guy's name is. Like I said, I almost went to sleep a couple times, so I ran out of something to drink, which usually keeps me awake. So, okay, well, I'll talk to you guys next week, and of course, in the next 20 seconds, I'll remember who that guy was.